I welcome all the guests that we have today. We are very honored that they accepted our invitation to participate to this, which is the last seminar of the series on bioethics and racism. I thank the students, and I thank Carlo Botrugno, who is going to introduce our guests for the organization of this seminar. So today we are going to speak about racist and anti-racist practices and politics. And I leave the floor now to Carlo so that he will introduce our speakers. Thank you again for being here this afternoon.
Thank you, Lucia. So welcome everybody. Here we are for this fourth and final seminar of the Bioethics in Action seminar series, which is dedicated to racist and anti-racist practices and policies. I'm going to introduce immediately our speakers of today. It is our pleasure to have Djamila Ribeiro, Eduardo, Rueda, and Lucia. Djamila Ribeiro has a master's degree in political philosophy from the Federal University of São Paulo and is professor in the Department of Journalism at the Pontifical Catholic University of São Paulo. She is coordinator of the Sueli Carneiro editorial seal and the Plural Feminist collection. She is author of several books and a columnist of Folha de São Paulo newspaper. Was also Deputy Assistant of Human Rights for the City of São Paulo in 2016, and she was awarded the 2019 Prince Claus Award granted by the Kingdom of the Netherlands and considered by the BBC as one of the 100 most influential women in the world the same year. Eduardo Rueda is currently a professor at the National University of Colombia. He is a member of the International Bioethics Committee of UNESCO, as president of the Latin American and Caribbean Network for Higher Education in Bioethics, RED-LACEP. He is executive director of the Network for Ethics and Citizenship Education, RED-ETICA. He is co-founder and board member of the International Network on Biolaw, former head of the Latin American Working Group of Political Philosophy, Latin American Council of Social Sciences, and former director and associate professor at the Institute of Bioethics of Pontificia University of Javeriana. Finally, Lucia is a professor of philosophy of law and professor of the International Graduate Program on Politics of Globalization and Human Rights here at the University of Florence. He is the director of the journal Euragentium and the member also of the research unit on everyday bioethics and ethical science. She published recently the book Vulnerable Democracies, which is going to be published also in Brazil. The Bioethics in Action seminar series is being organized within her course on politics of globalization and human rights. So we have also her students among the attendees. And finally, there is also Alice Toyeta, who is giving a very nice face to this seminar series. So she will go without, in the meantime, we will talk. She will get inspiration, this very hard task, I have to say. And then we will share the drawings at the end of the seminar. So I won't waste any time more, and I give the floor immediately to Djamila Ribeiro. You have the floor, Djamila.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity, this opportunity of exchanging knowledge. It's very important. Thank the University of Florence. And it's an honor to participate of this important seminar about bioethics. I'll talk about a little bit about the reality in Brazil. I think it's important to say what we think that racism is, because in Brazil you have a very specific reality, because Brazil was the country that created the idea of racial democracy, or that the racism is only individual and not a system. That's why I quote Kabengele Munanga, who is a very important professor here in Brazil. He is from Congo, but he teaches in a very important university here in Brazil. Racism is a system of oppression that creates historical inequalities between racial groups. In Brazil, it takes on its specificities, and to understand it, it's necessary to differentiate it from other known experiences, such as the Nazi regime, the South African apartheid, or the situation of the Black population in the United States in most of the 20th century, in which racism was explicit and institutionalized by laws and official praxis. In the words of Kabengele Munanga, an important Brazilian thinker, I quote, undoubtedly, all races are abhorrent, and each one make it victims in its own way. The Brazilian is not the worst nor the best one, but it has its peculiarities, among which the silence, the unspoken, that confuses all Brazilians, men and women, victims and non-victims of racism. So the myth of racial democracy, this idea of non-racial conflicts in Brazil, was very present in our epistemology and how the Brazilian state dealt historically with racism. In An Ambiguidade do Racismo Brasileira, The Ambiguities of Brazilian Racism, Munanga summarized the power of the racial democracy myth, and I quote, "The myth proclaimed in Brazil a racial paradise where relations between white and black people, white people and Indians, etc., are harmonious, that is, without prejudice and without discrimination, except for socioeconomic order, which affects all Brazilians and is not based on skin color. In order to consolidate and become increasingly stronger, the myth manipulates some facts evidenced in the reality of a Brazilian society, such as miscegenation, mythical personalities, and symbols of Black cultural resistance in the country. It will say that we are a mestizo people, that is, neither white, neither Black, nor Indians or indigenous, a new Brazilian race, a mestizo race, who will discriminate against whom if we are all mestizos." End of the quote. So this is the idea that was proclaimed by very important white intellectuals in Brazil. This idea of here in Brazil, everybody's mixed, there is no races only United States or South Africa, that here is different. So this idea was very, this idea was powerful in Brazil, and at the same time that avoid Brazilian people to raise awareness on racism or on Blackness. People in Brazil who didn't see themselves as Black, for example, because of this romantic idea of non-racial conflicts. As we delve deeper into the study of race relations in Brazil, we understand the specifics of being a Black woman. At the base of the social pyramids in Brazil, Black women are neither white nor male, being a double antithesis of whiteness and masculinity, according to Professor Grada Quilombo. The great Black Brazilian feminist Sueli Carneiro asked in her work about Black feminism, when you talk about women, what women are you talking about? And I quote Sueli Carneiro, "When we speak of the myth of feminine fragility, which historically justified the paternalistic protection of men over women, what women are you talking about? We Black women are part of a contingent of women, probably in the majority, who have never recognized this myth in themselves, because we have never been treated as fragile. We are part of a contingent of women who worked for centuries as slaves in the fields or on the streets as salespeople, greengrocers, prostitutes, women who did not understand anything when feminists said that women should win the streets and work. We are part of a contingent of women with object identities. Yesterday, at the service of fragile little aides and pervert sugarcane mill masters. This new feminist and anti-racist view, by integrating in itself both the struggle traditions of Black movement and the tradition of struggle of the women's movement, affirms this new political identity arising from the specific condition of being a Black woman, End of the quote. So Sueli Carneiro, Lélia Gonzalez, important Black feminists in Brazil, they were very fundamental to make visible the reality of Black women. And they were discussing the own intersectionality. But as these women, they were thinking and producing in Portuguese, their productions are not known abroad. So Lélia Gonzalez, she was doing reflections on intersectionality in the 80s. And she was a pioneer in Brazil to say how the politics of translations are also colonial politics, and how it's important also to discuss this invisibility of the productions of women that are in the global south. So to think about racism as politics and to think anti-race politics, it's also necessary to think about the politics of translations. So intersectionality, it's a very important concept for Black women. Kimberly Crenshaw, she wrote about intersectionality in the 80s. So in a Black feminist perspective, we mobilized the tool of intersectionality developed by the American thinker Kimberly Crenshaw, although in Brazil, in the other parts, there were women that were thinking about intersectionality to understand how the structure of race, class, and gender interact in a combined way, placing social groups at the crossroads of oppression. And I quote Crenshaw, intersectionality is a conceptualization of the problem that seeks to capture the structural and dynamic consequences of the interactions between two or more axes or subordination. It specifically addresses the way in which races, patriarchy, class oppression, and other discriminatory systems create basic inequalities that structure the relative positions of women, races, ethnicities, classes, and others. So for us, Black feminists, it's impossible to think about racism without thinking about gender and class. These are structural oppression, and these oppressions interact. So to be a Black woman, it means that we experience gender through race. So how it's important to think all these oppressions in not separated. So the discussion on racism in Brazil, of course, it's important. It was the last country in America to end slavery. Black people in Brazil, the majority of the population in Brazil, due to the incredible work of the Black movement in Brazil, today in Brazil, most of the population, they declare themselves as Black. And Brazil, it's a country, I can say some data. In each 23 minutes, a young Black man is killed by police in Brazil. We are talking about a contingent of people that mostly live in the slums. We are talking about a vulnerable group in terms of rights in Brazil. But if you think about also indigenous people in Brazil, it's also important to think about indigenous people when you're talking about races. But in our perspective as Black feminists, it's very important to not separate the discussion, because as Black women, we are living gender through race, and that's why we are the basis of the society in Brazil. So we cannot fight against a structure without fight against another structure, because you are not thinking about a democratic project if you just choose talk about races and ignore gender, class, or sexual orientation, and not understand how these oppressions interact. At the same time, that's to challenge the myth of racial democracy when we recognize the structural character of racism. The intersectional perspective qualifies the formulation of anti-racist practice, reaching the most varied social groups. As Deputy Secretary for Human Rights in the city of São Paulo under the administration of Fernando Haddad, I had the chance of working on some important public policies from an intersectional perspective. Among them, I highlight the following. Trans citizenship. The Trans Citizenship Program promoted the political and professional training for trans and travestite women in situations of social vulnerability in the city of São Paulo. The results were fantastic. While working to increase the social index of this social group, the entire city experienced an increase in its index, promotes a positive impact in change. The intersectional perspective was fundamental because, of course, we were working with Black trans people, poor trans people, and this was a very important program in São Paulo during Fernando Haddad's administration. Data map, mapping of the most violent neighborhoods for young Blacks in São Paulo, when it was found that the data collected did not match the data provided by the state government. So the research was fundamental for the formulation and improvement of public policy, especially for Juventude Viva, the name of this public policy, Living Youth. That was this important policy of the city of São Paulo that I'm going to talk about more. The Juventude Viva Living Youth program was developed by the federal government, but only a few cities have adopted, including São Paulo. In territories with high rates of violence, the municipality financed the sponsors of cultural and social events to raise awareness among the population where there was the highest rates of murders of young Blacks. So it was very important because this program in poor neighborhoods in São Paulo, and how in each neighborhood they had a different reality, and in each neighborhood there were a person there that was responsible to talk with these young Black people and to do the program, to actually implement the work and this policy with this in that neighborhood. It was a very important program in São Paulo, although in São Paulo the municipality is not responsible by the police because the state is responsible by the police in São Paulo, but as a city we understood that was necessary to do something in this specific area, and Brazil is a very violent country for Black youth. LGBT centers. LGBT centers are places of care for victims of discriminatory violence, where free legal, psychological, and social assistance is provided. Most of the human rights programs were abandoned with the rise of the current political power of the now president of Brazil. But even in São Paulo, in the city of São Paulo, the other mayor ended with these programs. But I think it's important to present to you and to say that intersectionality is not only a concept, but also a very important tool to think about public policy, and to think about intersectionality is important to make visible the reality of people of groups who interact with one or more oppression. I like to give this example. In Brazil, there is a law, a 2006 law, that criminalized domestic violence. It's a very important legal mark in Brazil, for sure. But when this law completed 10 years, there was a very important research called Map of Violence. And the results were very, the results were very impressive, because in 10 years that this law was implemented, there was a decrease of the violence against white women, about 10%. In the other hand, there was an increase of the violence that committed Black women, about 55%. It's a very high number. And what the Black feminists in time said, most of them, there was a lack of an intersectional view to create this policy, because it is not enough to say for a Black woman in Brazil that she needs to denounce. Most of these women live in slums, in places that they cannot call the police. The relations that these women have with the policy is a suspicious relation, because it's the same policy that they are killing their sons, their children. So it was important to improve the network, the public policies to attend women, not only in the legal perspective, but also to increase the number of the centers that attend these women, the necessity to think these centers in these peripheries, not only in downtown, in places that sometimes these women, they don't have money to go there. So how it's important to improve this policy, not only thinking the legal perspective. So another policy that we tried to create in São Paulo was the psychosocial support for Black women who have lost their children to police violence, a partnership with the Department of Health to assist mothers whose children were killed by police violence, a tragic reality common in the country, where every 8 minutes a young Black man is murdered. Why did you make this policy? Now, policy violence is not a municipal competence, but data were collected from others who have become psychotic ill, even died of sadness in the face of this reality. So we understood that it was important to support. The project was entirely formulated, however, as it depended on the endorsement of the Minister of Health. The federal government, after the dismissal of Dilma Rousseff, vetoed the initiative. And it was not possible to deliver this important public policy for the population because of the federal government at the time. Well, now I want to talk about the editorial market in Brazil. I think it's fundamental, the discussion on the epistemicide. What we understand as epistemicide? It was a concept developed by Boaventura Souza Santos, but that in Brazil, Sueli Carneiro, she was very important to spread this concept in Brazil, this idea of the assassinations of the epistemologies of Black and indigenous people, and how, if you do not face the colonial perspective on Black people or indigenous people, we are not facing racism, because the basis of the racism, the theories, biological theories of the 19th centuries that proclaimed that Black people were inferior, and how it's important in a country like Brazil, that our academia is Eurocentric, that the white man is the moral, the epistemological paradigm, how it's important to face that to make possible other epistemologies and epistemologies that restitute humanity for Black people. Because if the black man, he was conceived by the colonial perspective as violent, as aggressive, when this Black man die, for example, what people would say, oh, he was violent, he must be, a criminal, that's why he is dead now. So it's important to understand how these constructions try to justify the way Black people is treated. So for us as Black feminists in Brazil, it's very important to confront the epistemological racism. As a writer and editor, I have sought in recent years to work for change in the Brazilian publishing market in defiance to the racist and patriarchal organization of this sector. Whoever has social privilege has epistemic privilege. So in addition to public policies to combat discrimination, we must pay attention to the production of knowledge that theoretically justify these structures. In a period of 50 years up to 2014, 90% of the books published by major publishers were written by white people, 70% of which were white men, data from University of Brasília. Conceição Evaristo, a great Black Brazilian writer, gave an interview in which she said that we must question the system that made her known to the general public at the age of 70. So in 2017, I started with the Sueli Carneiro book seal to honor Sueli Carneiro, honoring the great Brazilian Black feminist Sueli Carneiro. The Sueli Carneiro book seal was founded in 2017 and non-fiction literature written by Brazilian and Latin American Black women, mostly, and men. The book seal started with Rights of a Life from Carneiro and also published Carla Cotirene work about Black women in prison in Salvador, Bahia. Recently, the seal published Mulheres Quilombolas, Quilombolas Women, a reunion of 18 women of Quilombo from all around the country, writing from their perspective and epistemology, a pioneer initiative. Also inside the book seal, there is the Plural Feminism collection. Using didactic language and affordable prices, the Plural Feminism collection has brought pocketbooks that address critical racial themes written by Black women and men. In a long-reading country, more than 300,000 books have been sold, with media repercussions as well as adoption in most undergraduate and postgraduate programs at universities. We are going from north to south of the country before the pandemic, of course, taking non-colonial bibliography, inspiring reading clubs in peripheries and public school to raise awareness, as well as improving political conviction, revolutionizing the publishing market in Brazil. Lélia Gonzalez, again, she was very important in Brazil, and she was very important to say that we needed to create instrumental. That yes, it was important to organize demonstrations, riots, it was very important, but also it was necessary as Black people to organize ourselves to face the intellectual production in a country that was conceived the racial democracy myth that most of the people do not have access to critical reflection on racism, on sexism, on capitalism. It was very important to do that, especially in Brazil, that especially now under Bolsonaro administration, the public policies on education are being ended, and there are not investments in these public policies. And being Black, it's not a condition to understand what racism is or the consequences of racism. Yes, you can maybe experience racism and understand that there is a problem, but at the same time, you maybe you cannot, or you can reproduce the ideas of a racist society. So that's why, especially in Brazil, that these critical reflections are not available for most of the population. Lélia Gonzalez inspired us to do that. Up to now, 10 titles have been published: Place of Speech, written by me; Mass Incarceration by Juliana Borges; Empowerment by Joyce Bert; Intersectionality by Carla Cotirene; Structural Racism by Silvia Almeida; Recreational Racism by Adilson Moreira; Cultural Appropriation by Rodney William; Religious Intolerance by Sidney Nogueira; Colorism by Alessandra Debuschi; and the last one, Transfeminism by Letícia Nascimento. Making these authors and epistemology visible has led to a fantastic result in the public debate. They were pioneering actions in this sense, starting with the critical racial debate. I think it's very important to say that we are doing this now, but before us, of course, there were very important initiatives in Brazil, as Editora Palas, Mas Edições, Cadernos Negros, a lot of people that were doing that for sure, but just continuing a work that started before us. But I think that now we was able to make this more popular in Brazil, because we use social media to do that. The books are affordable books. We decided to do events in public spaces, not only in a bookstore, for example, because in bookstore there are a lot of people who don't feel that they belong to that place. So we did a lot of events in different countries of Brazil, breaking this idea of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, in the north, in the northwest, in different places. And with some partnerships, we donated thousands of books to public schools, to libraries, public libraries in Brazil, and also in these events. For example, the first 100 people that arrive will receive a book. We did that with some partnerships with some entrepreneurs who buy the books from us, and we could donate for the public. So to understand the editorial market in Brazil, it's very difficult to keep independent projects with any kind of support, because 50% of the books, the price of the books belongs to the bookstores. So that's why we decided also to not do all the events in bookstores, because it's without doing that, we can reach more people, and also it's better for the authors to have the rights to receive their rights. This is an event that happened in Belo Horizonte, in Brazil, in 2018. There were about 2,000 people there to a book launch of the Plural Feminism collection. So I think to think about racism in Brazil, I think it's necessary to understand how it in Brazil was established. How the racial democracy myth was in Brazil created this wrong idea about what racism in Brazil, how the idea that is spread abroad of Brazil is the idea of the carnival country, the idea that everybody is happy, the idea of sexualization of women, especially Black women, and how it's important to confront this idea, and not only to look up to Brazil in the perspective of this colonial view, or the perspective of the absence, but also in the perspective of Black people that historically are organized to create anti-racist policies, to confront the idea of racial democracy myth, and also to create new possibilities of existence for Black people in Brazil. Thank you. Como é que eu saio aqui?
Thank you. Carla, are you going to speak to introduce our next guest, or do you want me to do it?
Sorry, I was talking, but my phone was on mute. Thanks, Djamila, for your interesting, for sharing this experience from your field, and you provide us with a very interesting concept from anti-racist thinking. And you introduce several concepts that are fundamental to this seminar series. I cannot mention all of them, social democracy, but politics of translation, but particularly the access to the knowledge. So the power of the epistemology and the control over the epistemology. Which is nice because it's a very good bridge to the presentation of Eduardo Rueda, who will talk about the epistemic racism. So I give the floor to Eduardo.
Thank you,
Please.
Carl. Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you. Thanks to Florence University. It's an honor to share the floor with Djamila and the other colleagues, and of course, I am very much grateful with Lucia because her welcome within her project. How can I share my screen, my presentation?
I already gave you the power to do so. You should see something share at the bottom of your screen, usually.
At the top.
It depends. I have it at the bottom, so either at the bottom or at the top.
No, excuse me. Yeah. No, I'm not able. Maybe.
I'm sorry. Oh dear. I'm sorry.
Okay. Carlo, maybe I should send my presentation to you, and you can share the slides. Okay,
yes, because I did it before I could do it, and now I don't see the possibility to give him the power to do so. Imposta come relatore, non lo posso più fare.
Yeah, no problem. Carlo, what is your email, Carlo? Excuse me. L'altro diritto webes. What can I?
Yeah.
Everyday Bioethics. I mean.
Yeah.
Okay.
Lucia, I don't have also, non ce l'ho neanche io quel.
Sì, ma te lo posso dare. A lui invece l'avevo dato prima e non so cosa è successo, non lo posso più dare.
Ok.
Tu adesso dovresti averlo.
Okay, I already sent it. Please.
Ce l'hai te ora, Carlo?
Un attimo, ancora no. Ok.
Perché io ora vedo anche la possibilità di ridarlo a lui, ma forse meglio.
Prova allora, prova.
Eduardo, I try again because I see that you could do it. I try again to give you the power.
The problem is that when you invite me to share my presentation, I have to. I can read the little square in which it says I have to make some changes in my system.
Okay. Don't worry. I'm going to.
Okay. Fine. So I give it to Carla. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Contenuto. Let me know if you can see.
Yeah, I can see it perfectly. I get it. So I will indicate you next.
Okay.
next slide.
Yeah, please.
Okay, next. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk about epistemic racism. Next one, slide, please, Carlo. Here the outline of the presentation. Please, the previous slide. Yeah, the present slide. Yeah, the second one. Yeah, so I'm gonna to say some word on race and racism before addressing the specific topic I'm going to talk about today. Then I'm going to refer to nature as the tired of epistemic hegemony and as the main device to exclude and discriminate other epistemologies. After that, I'm going to move to explain how epistemic exclusion works today, even within the academy, as Djamila has explained in her presentation before. And in the end, I will address some ethical implications. Next one, please. So what does race mean? I'm going to quote Mudembe, who was wrote in 2018, a very important book, which title is The Black Man. And Mudembe said in that book that race, I'm quoting, operating over the past centuries as a fundamental category that is at once material and phantasmatic, has been at the root of catastrophe, the cause of extraordinary psychic destruction, and of innumerable crimes and massacres. Yeah, as the presentation of Djamila showed just minutes ago, it is the case in many countries of the world, including Colombia, in which the recent violence that you have heard on news has to do with precisely racism. Being part of what Mudembe calls exclusionary thinking, race, with categories such as gender, class, and nation, can indicate as Mudembe explained, as the ways to restore the humanity stolen from those who have historically been subjected to processes of abstraction and objectification. So racism constitutes the colonial framework in which race is constructed as a target of exclusion and objectification, as well as race must be understood both as a target of discrimination, exclusion, and objectification, and also, as Mudembe has tried to say, a key of emancipation. This is also a way in which, for example, Aníbal Quijano in Peru has addressed the concept of ethnicism, which has very much to do with this topic, of course. Next one. So historically, as Mudembe has shown us, race has, as he said, necropolitically built in the confluence of capitalist productivity, nature instrumentalization, and the modern idea of an ever better future. Of course, I am referring here to the idea of progress. Knowledge was also reshaped within this colonial framework, in which race was built as a target of discrimination, in ways that subalternize and even eliminate other ways of knowledge. Three main features characterizes the colonial way of shaping nature. I'm going to refer firstly to the ways in which the colonial framework shape nature. So nature is desubjectivized. She is then converted in it. Nature and culture became different and separate realms as a consequence. Nature is subjected also to instrumentalist narratives. For example, we can remember Heidegger's idea of theoretical technology of sciences. Sciences is just a theoretical technology. Nature was converted then in a set of inert things under the control of culture. And the third main feature which characterized the colonial way of shaping nature is this one. Nature was structured as a set of physicalist facts which are in opposition to social values. So facts and values are different things. Facts belong to nature and values to society. Natural order was not anymore, under this way of understanding, a source of ethical mandates, but just facts, called facts, physicalist facts. Next one, please. This colonial epistemic framework under which nature was thus subjected was functional to capitalism, cultural Eurocentrism, and segregation of the others, now turned, according to this new knowledge, into races or ethnias, and contributed this colonial epistemic framework to make invisible and to devaluate and eliminate the other ways, or the subalternized ways of knowledge. These ways of subalternized knowledge were rooted in very different presumptions in comparison with Western science, for example, about nature and culture. I'm going to mention three different presumptions that underlie the knowledge of non-Western peoples and cultures. In the first place, nature can be understood not just as an inert set of things, but as conscious, thought, memory. And in this way, nature is not separate from culture, but it can be also a source of culture. On the other hand, nature teaches how to order, build, and healing our human world. So she is a master in several existential levels, and not just a target on what we are willing to instrumentalize in the nature. And another important presumption in these subalternized ways of knowledge is that nature is the multi-level realm of connection. So it is not anymore somehow a different set of different objects independent one of each other. And in that way, mind and matter, so culture and facts, are connected expressions of the unimultiple thought of nature. So we according to the ancestral or ancient ways of knowledge or traditional knowledge that many people have kept and guarded along centuries in resistance to this epistemic hegemony of the colonial framework, the mind and the mind and the matter, the facts of nature, and the nature as memory and thought are very much connected. Are very much connected. So what I want to say is that thoughts and memories and values are expressions that can be also materialized, so to speak, in the ways in which nature expresses itself. So in in the way in which the mountains or the rivers or the trees are expressing in the world. Okay, next one, please. In the end, this colonial exclusionary thinking, the colonial framework, made equivalent true knowledge, so the knowledge from science, to different kinds of instrumentalist thinking certifiable by specific experts and colonial-centered epistemic institutions. The knowledge of the others, so the knowledge of the non-Western, were thus converted in superstitions, beliefs, and pseudosciences, and not anymore was considered as knowledge or science, of course. Therefore, colonial epistemic hegemony, which was in hands of science, has been crucial to organize and fuel both productivity and material progress, mostly under the so-called development, while progressively deepens the illegitimacy of the knowledge of the non-Western others. So this was the way in which the colonial device worked to, on the one hand, push up capitalism in hands of science, of course, and the industry, and at the same time producing the exclusion and the some kind of picture of the knowledge of the non-Western others as if it was just superstition, beliefs, or pseudosciences, and then some kind of beliefs that couldn't have the status of knowledge. The next one, please. So this epistemic hegemony, which excludes the knowledge of the others, has been, as we know, a common practice in many fields. So excluding the knowledge of the others has been a common practice in many fields. For example, for instance, in defining and building civil engineer projects, we of course have a lot of stories here in Latin America regarding the ways in which ethnias and many Afro communities have resisted these kind of roads projects and hydroelectric projects, which are clearly against their legitimate interests and values. We have also seen the ways in which the excluding of their knowledge has worked in shaping and organizing health policies and healthcare services. We have a lot of stories regarding the ways in which the cultural ways of imagining and working in the health field has been excluded. We have examples also in the sector of producing food and educational problems, and in dealing with animals, rivers, mountains, etc., not just in a material but in a subjective way. So we have a lot of circumstances that explicitly expose the way in which the knowledge of the others are permanently excluded. So next one, please. But moreover, this epistemic racism occurs also in the academy. And it is a very sad situation, as Djamila has told us recently. So I put here in the slide this new, which is a publication from a professor of archaeology from Simon Fraser University in LA, a publication that he wrote in February 2019, in which he says that he received a lot of critics and indignation for his readers because he had published an article in which he advocated the value of the indigenous traditional knowledge regarding animal behavior, coastal ecology, and history, and yeah. And some of the critical comments that he received were included sentences like, for example, I quote, "I think that Smithsonian Institute, because he wrote to the Smithsonian, an Smithsonian publication, should not have published such an extreme and postmodernist and anti-science article." And it's just because he just mentioned and identify the way in which indigenous traditional knowledge clearly had a lot to teach us about different fields. He also received the comments, for example, like this one that which said that I quote, "This was an astoundingly bad article that a good science editor should have blocked." So I wanted to put this new on the slide because it is useful to identify the ways in which within the academy the knowledge of the others has been a target of exclusion, of permanent exclusion. This situation has also equivalent cases in, or we can see the same situation, I mean, in Mexico, in Colombia, in Brazil, Argentina. Well, we have a lot of stories, unfortunately, about the way in which these things occur here also. Next one. So the ways in which epistemic racism works today within the intellectual field has to do with these assertions. I'm going to read these as assertions, and then I'm going to consider each one in a critical way. The first one is that acknowledging indigenous or non-Western knowledge as such entails an anti-science position. So the first assertion is that. The second one is that indigenous knowledge cannot be authentic knowledge since it is not the product of applying the, sacred scientific method. The third one says that indigenous knowledge is regressive. So trying to advocate indigenous knowledge or non-Western knowledge is somehow trying to go back to the Middle Ages or so on. And the fourth assertion is that pairing indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge is irresponsible. I'm going to consider each one. Next slide, please, Carlo. So, see the first one. What can we say about the first assertion about according to which acknowledging indigenous knowledge as such entails an anti-science position? In principle, we could say that is precisely the opposite. I mean, anti-science position entails prejudices and disregarding evidence or others' arguments. So if we disregard indigenous knowledge, we are precisely incurring in an anti-science position, since we are not taking seriously because we are under prejudices or false presumptions. We are not taking seriously the evidences or the arguments that other knowledge can show us. Well, the second assertion, which says that indigenous knowledge cannot be authentic knowledge since it is not the product of applying the scientific method. It should be considered, and from my point of view, in the following way. Scientific method is not the unique way of knowing. It's the way of knowing that the colonial capitalist device naturalizes and accredited. It's the way of knowing of some people in some time of history. I mean, Europe in the modern ages. Other methods include theoretical modeling of the world. For example, one example of that, among many others, is the Hippocratic medicine. Rules of similarity or resonance between different entities, which is very different, which is a very well and sedimented way of producing knowledge in many cultures. Long-term empirical observation, which has to do with inductive inferences, which has a very long-term evidence to be done. Proliferation of counter-inductive hypotheses, which, for example, we can remember the work of Paul Feyerabend that has shown us in a very robust way that the science has evolved not precisely because the obedience to the scientific method, but for precisely the disobedience to it. And empathy. Empathy is also a way of knowledge. For example, primatology was a science, has been a science that was structured going through using the methods of empathy, among many others. So disregarding the multiple ways in which knowledge has been produced is incompatible with an authentic knowledge of the history of knowledge itself, or even the Western sciences as well. Third, excuse me, Carlo, next slide. So consider that this third assertion, according to which indigenous knowledge is regressive. We can say that revealing a knowledge that has been disregarded or abandoned because of prejudices or mistaken presumptions is equivalent to correct a false assertion instead of being just regressive. Actually, in the history of Western science, these corrections have been common. For example, Wegener's theory on tectonic plates was abandoned for almost 50 years. Nobody will say that those scientists that revealed Wegener's theory 50 years after he made it were regressive. No, those scientists did were to correct mistakes or prejudices that precisely impeded them to recognize the value of the theory. And this example can be multiplied in many different fields. So this assertion is totally misguided. And finally, this claim according to which pairing indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge is irresponsible would deserve the following comment. It is precisely the opposite. Assuming that scientific knowledge constitutes the only way for solving problems may be irresponsible since it implies discarding other cognitive tools potentially useful to solve those problems. Alternative descriptions of states of affairs can complement or coexist to the extent that they contribute to solving problems, which is precisely the target of knowledge or science. Knowledge is not a mirror in which nature is reflected better or worse, but a toolbox to deal with situated problems. So in that way of understanding knowledge in a, so to speak, pragmatic way, we have not really any strong argument to say that pairing indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge is irresponsible. I think that is precisely the opposite. Okay, so of course I cannot be exhaustive in considering other asserts regarding indigenous knowledge, but I try to consider probably the four yeah, that are more disseminated and accepted among the different normal scientists within our academia. Next one. So to finish this short brief lecture, I would like to consider the ethical implications of epistemic racism in 4 points. The first one, epistemic racism constitutes a persistent way of disrespect and undervaluate the non-Western peoples and knowledge. Under the shadow of epistemic racism, other peoples have been pictured as ignorant, barbarians, or exotic, which obviously entails, which treatment obviously entails a chronic naturalized way of humiliation. So this is very important because epistemic racism is a racism in the more strong way we can think about it. Second, epistemic racism has caused that those peoples and cultures, I mean, I'm talking about the non-Western peoples and cultures, have been subjected to and excluded of decisions that deeply affects their communities and ways of existence. We have a lot of stories regarding this affectation here in Latin America and worldwide. By means of this epistemic hegemony, their rights to self-determination have been eroded. So epistemic racism has to do with with undermining the political rights of the peoples or cultures that are subjected to that kind of racism. Moreover, the third point, epistemic racism underlies many bad decisions that have negatively affected many people, and I'm talking not just people of non-Western cultures, but people from that including the Western people, so to speak. So, for example, people who are living in cities or who belong to communities that are just suburban or peasant communities that cannot be considered as different ethnias or different people's cultures. So it is irresponsible. It is responsible. In fact, epistemic racism is irresponsible of environmental, gender, health, food, economic, and social damage. So, and not just, it is very important, and let me to emphasize this, not just for the non-Western people, but to everyone. We can see that situation here in Latin America, for example, regarding the way in which water has been affected because this way of thinking. And so epistemic racism is responsible for a lot of problems which have affected many people, and which could be problems which could be avoided if instead of exclusionary thinking, we would have an inclusionary thinking. We had include the knowledge and the perspectives and the approaches which have been chronically and permanently excluded from discussions and decision making. And finally, the so-called right to science, which UNESCO rightly advocates nowadays, must be understood as a guarantee to protect and dignify the knowledge and sciences of different peoples, not just the Western science, and open for them, so a guarantee to protect and dignify the knowledge and science of different people, and to guarantee that they will have the doors open and the channels open to be socially valued and usable. The right to science must be advocated in a non-ethnocentric, non-colonial way. So thank you very much. Next one. Gracias. Thank you. Gracias.
Thanks, Eduardo. Many thanks for this very rich overview on epistemic racism and the need to give value to the other forms of knowledge. There will be many considerations to do. We will have some minutes after the last presentation by Lucia to discuss. But just I would like to say that when we created the research unit on everyday bioethics, one of the goals, it is also written in the mission statement, to promote the other forms of knowledge behind the scientific one. So of course, this is very fundamental to the reps. Before to give the floor to Lucia, I would like to say to our participant, if you want to start to ask something, to anticipate some question in the chat, you can do it, or even at the end you can even talk. So it's now the time of Lucia, who will talk about necropolitics, racism, and migration management. Lucia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Carlo. I turned your microphone off, maybe.
No, you're okay.
No, it's you that you have your microphone on.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you. I really thank our guests for these very beautiful speeches that they gave and lectures that they gave. And in what I'm going to say, you will see that there are many references which are common, especially with Eduardo Rueda, because I speak of necropolitics. Of course, my reference is, of course, Aquila Member's work in this title already. So I will develop some reflection on racism and migration policies, referring to the EU, to the European Union. Of course, I must say, first of all, that processes of othering have been at work in the construction of various figures of European identity, although they are not, as we know, exclusive to the history of the continent. They are found in various forms of nationalism, as they are functional to delimit the boundaries of a political community on the basis of belonging to a people, which in Europe is often imagined as ethnos, a group of people linked by blood ties. So this idea of the people is explicit in the nationalist rhetoric of many European countries. It is less manifest in the United States, for example, where there is this image of the nation of immigrants. But that image is often contrasted with the barriers of color that still remain in American society. And then, as our guests said, this myth of a cohesive community that identifies itself by its opposition to others is also found in some Central and South American states. Not, of course, in the myth of métissage that Djamila reminded us about Brazil, but in the idea of distinguishing between citizens of European origin and indigenous people, as somehow Eduardo Rueda explained. So the colonial fracture runs throughout the body of contemporary liberal democracies in Europe and in other parts of the world, although it is often denied in the public discourse. It continuously resurfaces. Aquila Mbembe in Necropolitics says that liberal democracy has a solar body and a nocturnal body, which is a remnant of its violent genesis, disguised by the original myths of autonomy and self-government. The colonial system, the slave system, and the patriarchal system contributed greatly to the development of modern capitalist societies, leaving this bitter sediment. That's why intersectionality that Djamila Ribeiro mentioned is an approach that we need to have to all our problems, also speaking about races, of course. Liberal democracies are born as societies of separation, and they were based on the distinction between those who were within the sacred space that defined the community of the free, understood as chosen people, and the others. And these others were both people who were present within the territory of the state, but that were excluded from the social contract, like women, of course, and slaves, the poor, prisoners, disabled people, the mentally ill, etc. And people who were outside the territory, that is to say, especially in Europe, the colonized, kept outside of the boundaries of metropolis and relegated to the status of subjects. So this separation has never been completely removed, although the political and social conflict that have marked modernity have gradually admitted new categories of people to the sacred space. It is a division that influences the device of democratic citizenship and has allowed, as Bembe says, the institutionalization of a pattern of inequality on a global scale. So this colonial divide was already present, of course, in the history of European nation states. It accompanied their consolidation, and it played a central role in the birth of biopolitics and in the refinement of governmental techniques of population management. Now, in the post-colonial era, it remains, but it operates according to features that are partly in continuity with the era of colonialism and partly new. Bembe says that the current phase is characterized by necropolitics. That is a politics whose goal is to expose an increasingly large part of the population to violence and death in order to preserve the economic and social hierarchies of the capitalist system. This shift can be read in part as a return to an original form of capitalism, because capitalism was from the beginning animated by the drive to manufacture, as Bembe says, races and species, to calculate everything and convert everything into commodities that can be exchanged and to monopolize the manufacture of the living as such. But capitalism in its history encountered resistances that forced it to temper these drives and preserve with very outcomes, as Bembe writes, a number of fundamental separations without which the end of humanity would have become a clear possibility. Well, nowadays, the end of humanity is a clear possibility with the environmental crisis that we are experiencing. And this is because neoliberal capitalism tends to overcome these limits to the point of blurring the distinction between human person, object, animal, machine, expanding to planetary level the model of management of colonized population. In this framework, it pursues the systematic exclusion of a part of humanity, not only from the entitlement with rights, but also from the very possibility, as Bembe says, of inhabiting the world. These people are the people that Bauman called wasted lives, and Bembe called the black men or the Negroes, referring to the condition of black men under slavery and in the plantation. That is to say, a subordinate category of humanity which is considered as useless and is destined for segregation and expulsion. This condition is thus extended to a larger and larger portion of humanity. Let's think of India with the pandemic and what is happening there. Well, let's think of Palestine and what is happening in these days there. So this idea that there is a part of population which can be sacrificed is widespread, and it is extended to a larger and larger positions of humanity. But at the same time, the people who perceive themselves as white within the borders of the Western states, they fear to lose their racial privilege. And of course, we could say the same for sexism and the privilege of heterosexuality, for example. So these fears feed racism, not only in the form of Goliardic races, what Membe calls nanoracism, the micro races, which spreads in our societies, but also in the form of institutions that are maintained as racist, explicitly maintained as racist. Thanks to that form of hydraulic racism, that is a subtle racism formed by micro and macro legal, bureaucratic, and institutional devices of marginalization and segregation. Silvia Federici has reminded us that capitalism is based on hierarchies. First of all, the first hierarchy is the one that was highlighted by Judith Butler in Precarious Life in the aftermath of September 11, the one between grievable and ungrievable lives. So this different allocation of grief operates, as Butler wrote, to produce and maintain certain exclusive conceptions of the human in a normative sense. And it indicates what counts as a life to live and a death to grieve over. It is as much about the relationship between categories of humans as it is about the relationship between humans and other living beings. Membe emphasizes the idea that what he calls the Negro can be understood as the other of the manflux, digital, who is infiltrated everywhere by synthetic organs and artificial prostheses of all sorts, of a computer humanity, a new figure of the species, so typical of the new era of capitalism, in which self-reification represents the best opportunity for the capitalization of the self. So in both cases, we witness the production of unreal lives, lives which have been derealized and in which the exercise of violence no longer causes a scandal. Butler has spoken in this regard of zombies that have already died while still alive, that for this reason, once killed cannot be mourned. And these zombies are the same zombies that inhabit our fears and crowd movies and video games for the general public, and that are the metaphor precisely of a loss of humanity, but not only the humanity of the others that we have dehumanized, but also of ourselves, who are reduced to economic entities, as Paul Mason said, and are besieged by technology. In Brutalisme, which is another book that Membe published in 2020, Membe emphasized how necropolitics has a necessary consequence of the devastation of the planet. The predatory and extractive logic proper to the colony has in fact extended to the entire Earth. The universalization of the Black condition in the era of Capitalocene, in which the ecology of the planet is determined by capitalism, involves humans and other living beings, but does not reduce hierarchies. It universalizes the condition, but it doesn't equalize. It leaves the hierarchies and it reinforces the hierarchies in a horizon in which the production of wasted lives is increasingly an explicit goal of the economic and political system, where violent death is exposed with increasing frequency as in the colony, and it becomes routine. Let's think of the Mediterranean and all the people that died there, and we're really aware of this. Our course became the theater of this everyday tragedy. The French philosopher, liberal philosopher, Alexis de Tocqueville, who is very well known for his theory of democracy, in his overlooked colonial writings, wrote with reference precisely to the French colony of Algeria that the death of unarmed civilians, including women and children, is part of the unpleasant necessities of colonial war, a war that escapes from the mise en forme and that inevitably must be fought outside the rules established by the Jus in Bello. Today, as members said, this state of war became molecular. The line is continually being crossed. Contemporary wars are in fact not only those that are expressly called such and are fought on the various fronts open in the world, wars that often have their roots in the geopolitical order inherited from colonialism, but also those fought daily in the slums where the inhabitants are squeezed between the violence of crime and that of the police. In the West, and especially in Europe, these wars are waged against migrants, rejected at the borders and interned in camps or exploited in the countryside, according to a system that recalls the colonial system of plantations. And such wars are fought against the children of these immigrants, and young people belong to minorities excluded from the full enjoyment of citizenship rights, and often criminalized on the basis of racial profiles. Finally, it is what Laura Segato called the war against women, fought in every part of the globe and aggravated by the combination of different forms of intersectional discrimination. Tocqueville, in suggesting the policies to be employed in Algeria, theorized the need to distinguish between the rule of law that had to be applied to the coloners, to the French and the Europeans, and a regime of oppression without guarantees that was reserved for the colonized people. In his colonial writings, he insists on this point and shows his fear that the authoritarian methods employed by the military and the suppression of the division of powers in the colony would end up infecting the metropolis, a fear that has proven to be historically well-founded, as Aimé Césaire taught us. Today, the multiplication of colonial statuses is evident even in countries defined as Western, and especially in Europe. It is enshrined in law within Western societies, and it represents a serious danger to the stability of what we call international constitutionalism. This multiplication is becoming increasingly evident in migration policies in the European Union, to the point of characterizing EU citizenship itself as an exclusive citizenship, based on selection rather than inclusion, a citizenship that can increasingly be obtained by resident foreigners only by proving to have an adequate level of income, and after having gone through a long process that involves the passage through different statuses, from that of irregular immigrants to that of temporarily accepted residents, to that of long-term residents, according to paths that are rarely linear and where there is always the risk of returning to the starting point. As Encarnación Laspina has written, starting with the category of citizen and immigrant, which are assumed to be antagonistic, a series of intermediate categories consolidate and semi-citizens appear, made up of those immigrants who have acquired the status of residents but are not citizens, as well as those who have not regularized their administrative situation, thus remaining on the margin of the benefits of residency and therefore non-subjects. It can be argued that restrictive regulations on immigration and access to citizenship aim at a precarization of the legal situation of immigrants, according to a process that continuously oscillates between the two extremes of social inclusion and exclusion. This very rarely allows immigrants to overcome the iron cage. Non-citizens and semi-citizens cannot in fact benefit de jure or de facto from many fundamental rights, in particular political rights and some social rights. In this framework, the distinction between citizens and foreigners, as well as the enucleation of subcategories of immigrants, is functional to the maintenance of a relationship of force between individuals, groups, and the state. The path of access to citizenship is therefore studied with obstacles that transform it from a presupposition of inclusion through rights, according to the famous Thomas Marshall's well-known theory about citizenship, into a prize for a chosen few. This filtering system, moreover, works on the basis of more or less explicit forms of racialization. or which the degree of control to which one is subjected and the possibility of obtaining more easily long-term residence permits, family reunification, and finally citizenship depend on nationality, according to a logic that, for example, in Italy, privileges communities in which the majority of people profess the Christian, Catholic religion, such as Filipino or Peruvian. Even for citizens of EU member countries, European citizenship does not seem to have the same value. In fact, the rights of movement, residence, access to work, and welfare of Eastern European citizens are increasingly the subject of disputes and attempts to restrict them. The consolidation of a hierarchy based on different legal statuses, a sort of globalization of the French Code of de l'Indigénat of the French colonial empire, seems moreover to be the objective of a profoundly violent system of management of racialized population. Bembe, as well as Bauman, emphasizes the immobilization of large strata of the world's population. According to this reading, neoliberal globalization is based on the hierarchy between tourists and vagabonds, between citizens free to move on a planetary level and serfs confined to the lands dominated by their masters. For the racialized fractions of post-industrial societies, writes Mbembe, mobility choices are often limited to ghetto assignment or incarceration. In particular, those from the former colonies who try to escape the system of immobilization through immigration become public enemies and are treated as prey to be hunted, according to the logic of hunting that has always been applied to groups that have been inferiorized, even through the assimilation to the animal world. Let's think of Black slaves, Native Americans, colonial people, Jews, Roma, women, homosexuals, etc. Those who try to cross border, says Bembe, become themselves a border. The migrant body becomes a border. And so they multiply into thousands of border bodies. And in Europe, they are, above all, bodies of African men, women, and children, who more than other foreigners are considered as a threat. These are the bodies that we cannot save from drowning on the high sea or from dehydration in the middle of the desert, I quote Bembe. The objective of this hunt, however, in my opinion, does not seem to be so much as Bembe seems to think, the annihilation as an end in itself, as the selection and precarization of the existences of those who manage to cross the borders, and inclusion through illegalization, as was said by Djamila, which allows to achieve forms of differential inclusion, exactly like in the colony. So the wasted and ungrievable lives are warning for those who have managed to expatriate and who remain potential prey of a system that can reject them at any time. The universalization of the Black condition refers to a generalized decline of protection, to a precarization of lives, in the sense clarified by Butler. It is the news today in Italy that most of the people under 35 years have a precarious job and cannot leave their family house. So this precarization of lives is generalized, and more people find themselves deprived of state and social protection, taken into biopolitical and necropolitical mechanisms aimed at disintegrating their subjectivity. Body, personality, social relation are either put at value according to a logic of expropriation, or they are thrown away. Faced with this continuous reproduction of hierarchies, the anti-racist discourse in our democracies is weak, and it can even become hypocritical. If it is not combined with a strong condemnation of violence, it can contribute to the fiction of an inclusive society and to reestablish the neoliberal principle of competition, to obfuscate the social hierarchies and the obstacles that many people face every day, even once they have become citizens. In many Western democracies, as is the case in Italy, the political discourse contrasts so-called do-gooders, buonisti in the Italian debate, animated by humanitarian ideals often perceived as privileged, whose well-being is not threatened by immigration, and realists who oppose the need to protect fundamental rights to the need to limit immigration. This false opposition distorts the perception of reality. In fact, the so-called do-gooders are often nothing more than people fighting to preserve the structure of constitutional states and the democratic foundation on which they rest. Accepting the necropolitical hierarchies means, in fact, to bury the political project of international constitutionalism and its dream of equality. In turn, the realists think that immigration can be limited by progressively increasing the violence of the system. But there is nothing realist about policies based on violent border management. Realism would in fact mean finding systems which in part already exist, from humanitarian corridors to family reunification, to sponsor mechanisms and asylum policies, to manage immigration in a differentiated way while protecting human rights and fighting mafias and corruption. Ultra-violence, mafias, and corruption are instead part of neoliberal capitalism, a system that in the framework of the pandemic we are living as now, the pandemic we are living, has now shown its clearly violent face. So I would like to end this speech saying that after the pandemic, either we will awaken or we risk to succumb definitely to bury our constitutional state with all its fundamental rights. I'm a bit pessimistic, maybe, but this is the reflection that I developed in the face of what is happening also during these days. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lucia. Thank you for giving us this opportunity to consider also the situation of Europe. And I think your presentation provides us with a complex plot which racism intertwines with migration management, colonialism, and not least capitalism and biopolitics. So thanks again. I will now open the debate. If you, including the speaker, if you have some comments, if you want to say something else, or the participants, if you want to ask something to our speakers, please feel free to. I will sacrifice my questions. I have many, but I will prefer to don't make this space too much long. So feel free to ask something. Otherwise, I'll do mine. Okay, maybe I'll do something to break the ice. For Djamila, I appreciated very much your description of your effort, your editorial work to react to the epistemicide. But as academic, I was wondering what we can do also beside this this kind of promotion you are doing, which is wonderful. I think it's pivotal. But do you think there is something else we can do to react to this epistemicide? Wait for the mic.
Okay. Well, I think first of all, we need to know which political project you are supporting. You know, because today in Brazil we are facing a very difficult situation in terms of education. In the past few years, there were in Brazil very important policies to include Black people in universities. The first university was University of Rio de Janeiro in 2001, and then University of Brazil in 2004. And there is a federal law of quotas of 2012, and it was very important there were built more universities in Brazil, especially under Lula administration. So this is very important to create spaces for historically oppressed groups to have opportunity to go to university. But in the other hand, yeah, there were increases of Black people in university. I'm part of this generation. who had the opportunity, the first person in my family to have the opportunity to go to university. But in the other hand, when we arrive at the university, we have to deal with a very Eurocentric epistemology. So these need to change. The curricula needed to be rethinked in these terms. I think it's very important to do that, especially in Brazil. It's difficult because Brazil, it's a very huge country. At the same time, it's an island because you are the only, we speak this Brazilian Portuguese. The other countries in South America are speaking Spanish. We are kind of isolated, even in South America. But we are looking up to the global north all the time. So I think it's very, even the progressive side in Brazil, even people that declare themselves as left-wing people, they need to do a profound reflection on colonialism, how it's important to make visible the epistemologies of Black and Indigenous people in the universities, in our research, in our work. That is important law in Brazil, a 2003 law that established the obligation of the study of Afro-Brazilian and indigenous cultures in schools. It's a very important law, 2003 law. But the Black movement, the indigenous movement in Brazil are still fighting to have this law really implemented, because it depends on the government, it depends on the mayor or the governor. So that is a law, but still have to fight to have this law implemented. And it's very important, for sure, to include the obligation of the Afro-Brazilian perspective in history, mathematics, in all subjects. It was a win of the Black movement, but at the same time, we were fighting to have this implemented. But I really think that first of all, we needed to understand which political project are we supporting, but even when we are in a progressive government in Brazil, we still have to deepen the reflection that it's necessary to bring these voices, because it's not about giving voice. I don't believe in giving voice. We have voice, and our voices were silenced historically, and we need to change the curricula in universities. We need to change the editorial market that are still choosing who are going to publish, who is legitimized. So it's very important to face this very authoritative discourse that puts the white man as the epistemological paradigm. But I think in Brazil, majority of the population is Black. There are indigenous population, but still we are fighting to have our epistemologies legitimize it or recognize it in certain spaces.
Thanks for your interesting view on this topic. I also have a question for Eduardo. Actually, it's a very difficult one. I do not expect you to really answer to this. It's just an input. What bioethics can do in this context? Because we started this initiative by wondering what bioethics can do to fight racism. There is a discussion, there's a big discussion, especially in the United States on this. So we thought that it was fundamental to feed the debate. What is your opinion on this?
Regarding epistemic racism?
Yeah, also
racism,
in particular for what concerns the epistemic challenge, yeah.
Oh, okay, Caro, thank you for the question. I would like to say that bioethics, I think that in the beginning, actually bioethics was an interesting social movement. I mean, instead of being a discipline, or so to speak, or field of studies, in the beginning, bioethics emerged as a social movement. And I think that nowadays we are living in a situation in which precisely knowledge and others' knowledge and others' way of existence and others' way of thinking that were subalternized by the colonial framework, by the colonial device, must be pushed up into the social arena, and it entails the homework or the task of trying to give knowledge and give others ways of existence the form of social forces that can reshape our world. So in some sense, I think that bioethics has some role to play in order to make that this subalternized knowledge and other cultures and other ways of viewing the world and living the existence have a place in the social arena and in the social ways in which we are disputing the current problems we are facing with in our world. So this is a first task I think is very much important. The other thing that I think that bioethics has to do is trying to disclose the underlying values that certain ways of knowledge, of knowing the world, carry with. So, what I try to say is that we should we should stimulate some many analysis and many insights on the way in which values underlie different technical knowledge and different perspectives regarding the way of solving problems in many fields of our social world. So and it entails putting in question the old distinction between facts and values, of course, which is clearly a mistake. So and put that distinction in question could help us to disclose the values that underlie different epistemic perspectives on how to do different problems. And thirdly, I think that bioethics has to make a special work, trying to emphasize the way in which the subalternized peoples and knowledge has a lot of things to teach us about how to build a sustainable and an inclusive world, and not just that, but also a world, I don't know if the word in English is okay, a healed world. I mean, a world who was subjected to some kind of healing. So, yeah, we think that we are in a world that needs a lot of healing, and our ways of healing our different harms and to cope with different challenges. Our regular ways of doing that, which pass through the law and through the public policies and so on, are part of the of the response, but I don't know the total response we need. So I think that we should emphasize the ways in which these other ways of existence and knowledge can contribute to heal our world, to heal people, to heal people's minds, to heal people's relationships, to heal the ways in which people are feeling the world, feeling the others, feeling the animals, feeling the...
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks for your comment. There is also a comment from Maria Grace that thanks the speakers from presentation, and she said that something new should be developed in how ethics, the history of modernity, has supported the colonial logic of the world, because ethics supported the civilization project of modernity. So in that sense, I think bioethics has focused on the problem of the North, and in the North only on the problem permitted by the instrumental reasons. So I think what you can do is open the dialogue and change the term of the discussion in a very radical way. Thanks to Maria Grace for your comment. Last question, just briefly for Lucia. I would like to share this thinking I have, because I know that you have a relationship with the Brazilian university, so you are up to date on the reality in Brazil and to some extent also in Latin America. I often had this impression that in Latin America, even among young people, there is a kind of critical awareness about capitalism, the relationships, the oppression that it creates, the relationships of oppression. And also this is reflected in a kind of lexicon. I see many people still talking about capitalism, imperialism, which I'm not sure is still present in the Europe, but of course it was a few decades ago. I don't know. Just I would like to hear about you if you have this impression also, or maybe it's just my idea.
Yes, I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about Brazil. Maybe we should ask Djamila Ribeiro instead. From my experience, yes, me too. I was aware of this lexicon that reflects the Marxist tradition, especially in Brazil, and neo-Marxist influence, at least. Where I noticed that those words were used. Of course, there is a Marxist and neo-Marxist tradition in Europe as well, and in the West as well. But I must say that I think that in more recent times, especially because of the crisis that we are facing, both from the point of view of economics and politics, but also from the point of view of environment, and with the pandemic as well. This idea of capitalism and the need to reflect upon it, and this concept and its origin from an historical point of view, is felt not only by Marxist and neo-Marxist thinkers, but also by liberal thinkers or liberal economists. Let's think of Branko Milanovic, who defends his idea of capitalism, but they started to go back to those kind of concepts. So I do not refer directly to the Marxist tradition in using those concepts. I think that nowadays we are starting to realize that the neoliberal project is rooted in what we called capitalism, and that is the kind of regime that we are in. Then we can defend it as Branko Milanovic does, for example, or we can criticize it from different perspectives. I think, for example, that the concept of Capitalocene that I also refer to is an interesting concept, which allows us to better understand the climate change crisis and the environmental crisis. But of course, many Marxists and neo-Marxist thinkers would say we did not need to have this concept now. It's something that goes back to that tradition. So Yes. I'm really interested in what Eduardo Rueda said, and also from I read and learned something about ecofeminism, for example, and also constitutionalism in Latin America, which tries to, some forms of constitutionalism which try to have as a source different epistemics. I would like to know if he thinks that there is a place for law also in the way we experienced it in the constitutional tradition, and if this kind of tradition can, in his view, dialogue with these epistemics or not. Because you said that we should abandon somehow our old categories, and they are the problems, this idea of policies and laws, etc. That was interested in asking, what do you think about it? Should we abandon the constitutionalist tradition or
Thank you, Lucia. Yeah, I think that I just was trying to say that I think that to overcome the many problems that we have to face with nowadays as a global society, and also in the national and local spaces, law and public policy are not enough, but of course they are necessary as well. So yeah, and what I am trying to warn is that we shouldn't have all our hope put in hands of law or new public policies. All our hope, because we need to push up and also a more capillary, so to speak, changes in our world, and we have to move a lot of resources to heal the many ways in which peoples have suffered and have been harmed, and also the ways in which they have been impeded to to reach some kind of self-realizations of so self-realization is a very important topic, I think, nowadays. I am very interested, for example, in the work of Axel Honneth, which has recovered the category of self-realization to think about what are our challenges and the best ways to cope with in the political and in the in a large global community world, so to speak. So I regarding the question of the issue of capitalism, I think that also we should try to differentiate, to distinguish between modernity and capitalism. I think that we should do that because I am convinced, at least until now, that not that an anti-colonial project shouldn't carry us to move in an anti-modern project, which seems to me, regarding the constitutional thing, among others, somehow dangerous, because it could be, it might be a conservative, it might be against human rights or something, or be weakened in a way in which the anti-colonial fight cannot be articulated ethically in a robust way, because in the end it cannot, if the colonial project renounced to the normative modernity of human rights, maybe it would be the worst way to conduct an anti-colonial project, and maybe it would fuel some kind of conservative responses that we are really facing with in many countries nowadays. So I think that we should maintain that distinction. And if we do that, we would recognize the role, the very important role of law and constitutionalism. So, yeah, human rights.
Thanks, Eduardo. Thanks, everybody. We have to close, unfortunately, because we are 2 hours of seminar, and also Djamila have to leave. I would like to thank everybody. It has been a very exciting seminar series and a very rewarding journey for me and for all of us of the research unit. The effort requested for organizing it was very high, but the reward and satisfaction were higher. So let me say that we collected positive feedback since the first moment and from a large audience. I hope this seminar series contributed, been the opportunity for many people to learn something new. I would like to thank again all the speakers, participants, the endorsing institutions, the students of the course of Geopolitics of Globalization, Human Rights that stay with us, Lucia herself, Marcia Moselin Raimundo from Porto Alegre, who gave some contribution to the organization of the series, and also Alice Toyetta. Unfortunately, she had some problems. We will share her drawings in another way through emails. So we'll keep in touch for a new initiative from the Rebels on bioethics and racism. Thanks again, and keep in touch and stay active against racism.
Thank you,
Ciao.
Carla. Thank you, Lucia.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Djamila.
And
Okay.
thanks to the students.
Ciao.
Ciao,
Ciao.
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 Ciao, bye. Thank you.
Thank
Ciao,
you. Bye.
Bye. Ciao. Thanks again.
Ciao, Eduardo.